warming up.
I just see live now. It was like binary. It wasn't, and then it was.
Okay, so we are live. It is 12 o'clock noon. This is the continuous integration with Docker follow-up session for the Q&A. We have our panel from yesterday is returning to the conversation. So from left to right at the bottom of my screen, Brian Dawson from CloudBees, Curtis Yanko from Sonatype, Marcel Birkner from codecentric, and Olivier Boudon from Sonar Source has joined us. Just because some people may be viewing this that didn't attend yesterday's webinar, and we don't want to go through the don't want to have to point them to the introductions from yesterday. Let's just go through a quick round of introductions. I'll start with myself. I'm Derek Weeks from Sonatype. I am the Vice President and DevOps Advocate at Sonatype. I've been here for a couple of years, speak regularly at various DevOps developer and security conferences, and I help to orchestrate this panel discussion with some great guys and practitioners of these continuous integration tools that we're talking about as part of the tool chain discussions from yesterday. So these guys, rather than inviting marketing guys to talk about their particular products and how great the features and benefits are, I really wanted to bring people that had experience as practitioners, working with clients, working with customers, working in their own companies with these tools to provide the real kind of experience that we're looking for. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Brian. Brian, you can lead a quick introduction.
Yeah, hello, I'm Brian Dawson. I am a DevOps evangelist and practitioner with CloudBees, the enterprise Jenkins company. In that role, like Derek, I frequently speak at events, but I also help enable our customers in the community in using Jenkins to achieve CD and DevOps. I come into this with a background helping Fortune 500 companies implement continuous integration, continuous delivery, and DevOps.
Excellent. Curtis, you want to go next?
Sure. My name's Kurt Yanko. I'm in a solution architect role now with Sonatype for the last almost a year. I'm coming up on my anniversary. But when we talk about practitioners, I spent the previous 17, 18 years in large organizations. Started my career in SCM, sort of evolved through continuous integration into continuous delivery and DevOps, and my last two gigs were in Fortune 100 companies doing enterprise build and deployment systems.
Excellent. Marcel?
Hi guys, so this is Marcel Birkner from codecentric. I'm a software consultant, and I'm mostly working on Java project at customers. And since the start, I've always been the guy who's doing the CI setup and had the customer automate their release deployment processes. I'm also a speaker at various conferences on topics like continuous delivery, software automation, and yeah, so that's kind of what drives me, what I spend my free time on as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Marcel. Olivier, welcome.
Thanks. I'm Olivier Boudon, and I'm the CEO, one of the co-founders of Sonar Source. Sonar Source is a company that has been developing and promoting SonicQube for the last 7 years now. My background is development engineering, and application support at various companies. Olivier Boudon, and I'm the CEO, one of the co-founders of.
Oh, okay.
That was a bit of an echo.
Yeah. So, well, echoes happen in this chamber. So, so one of the things that we wanted to do, we had the webinar yesterday. We were talking about continuous integration with Docker environments, and we asked people to bring together their questions from that webinar. We've gathered a lot of questions, and we offered ourselves an hour to answer as many of those as we could, or to go through them and make sure that we got answers to people. So we have the list. Everyone presenting here has the list of questions in front of them, and maybe I could ask Marcel, do you want to lead off with your first favorite question from the webinar?
Sure. My favorite one. Okay. I'm just going to pick the first one that,
sure.
comes up. So that one is, I'm just going to read it out so everybody knows what the question is. So regarding SonicQube, do you recommend using it only as a reporting tool to be used by developers, or do you recommend it breaking the build? So we've been using SonicQube for quite a long time to measure source quality, source code quality in Java projects, PHP projects, also JavaScript projects, and usually I just like to have it as a reporting tool, but at my last customer we had it running for like 4 years as a reporting tool and sending out reports how many issues and violations there are in the source code, and that was simply just building or piling up to almost 5,000 violations in about 150 software projects. And then at some point we decided, okay, let's break the build between promote something from dev to production. So if you want to go to production, there cannot be new violations in your source code. And so that was pretty much further at the end of the pipeline. And then at some point, when people wanted to go to production and had new blocker issues and didn't fix the existing ones, they simply couldn't go to prod, and then they actually started fixing them. In my experience, it kind of depends on how your developers are and what mindset they have, and if they like software craftsmanship, or if they simply just want to implement a couple of lines of code and get it over with to have the feature ready. So yeah, it depends on the guys on the project. So that's my experience.
Okay, I think I would like to add on to this, because it's obviously also my favorite question. It was my favorite. Actually, we have SonicQube. We have come really a long way, and it was really it started really by being an integration tool, reporting. And we have moved it, and we are not done yet, but we have made very good progress. We have moved it from this reporting tool to more a tool which has multi usages. Which is, first of all, we have introduced a new product recently, which is called SonarLint, and which basically kind of integrates SonarQube into the IDE, but it doesn't integrate everything. It really provides you, like, for developers, quick feedback, instant feedback. You know, like we are talking here about like few hundred of milliseconds on all the rules that you have defined. You know, you centralize your stuff. Put SonarLint on it. It's kind of a spell checker for developers. You type your code, you get instant feedback. You open a file, you know where you stand. So really, our recommendation is to start using SonarLint in the IDE. That's the very first step. Then you can use SonicQube as a reporting mechanism, but it's not going to be very efficient. In that respect, I totally agree with Marcel. Where I don't quite agree, but I don't think we need to agree on everything here, is on the fact that you should break the build in order to get good results. We started to use this, and we moved away from this approach for many reasons that actually I'm going to share. We have posted a blog post recently to explain why we moved out of that. And the approach that we recommend is really to use SonarQube as the central piece that is going to check new code. We don't think it's a good idea to check existing and legacy code when you want to, especially for your dev team. They should be making sure that whatever they develop, whatever they change, is at the right level. And you can, the way we recommend to use SonarQube is really to put what we call a quality gate, which is basically the criteria which are going that you can go to production or not, and we recommend to put them on the water leak approach, which is basically on the new code. So that's our approach to SonicQube right now.
Curtis, I saw you might want to comment in there as well, just from your experience.
Yeah, I don't want to beat up this topic too much, but I do think there's a more generic question here, because it's something, even within our own tooling, we have the ability to break the build with what we provide at Sonatype, and it's not a practice that we recommend. And I think before we went live here, and as this topic was one of the more contentious ones that provoked a conversation, I think one of the things we could agree on is that the early part of the process, where the development teams are allowed to experiment and maybe very intentionally have some things in there that aren't quite right, because you can't get it all right at once. The goal is to get it done by the end of the sprint. We kind of agree that breaking it at that phase and creating that swarm reaction is maybe not the right idea. What Marcel pointed out, it was a little later in the cycle, it stopped him from getting to prod. And I think even what Olivier is sharing with us is that it's not the best idea to be breaking the build all the time with this stuff. If the build's always broke, you desensitize, and a lot of team dynamics fall apart. So I think there's as we do more continuous everything and shift all this stuff left, there's an increasing temptation to break the build on any of a number of concerns that might be getting looked at, and I think we have to be prudent about which ones we use and which ones we just make sure that the feedback's available, but don't necessarily break the build and block that production line. So I think there's a broader trend here, because a lot of tools are in this space now that traditionally weren't there.
Yeah, and I think there's a classic case of finding the right balance there. One of the things Curtis, if we break the build for too many things, eventually you get the reverse of the swarm mentality. People are just going to start to ignore the broken build. So the whole idea of stop the line is powerful, but it needs to be stopped for the correct reasons. It needs to be actionable. It needs to be important. I think the end goal, however you do it, though, is if you're using code scan and code quality metrics, as well as code coverage metrics, you need to ensure that those aren't ignored, that they're raised to the developer, they're reported to the developer, and as there's declining trends, they are aware. One of the things that we had done with SonicQube in the early days for one of my customers is we created an integration between SonicQube and TeamForge, in this case, the tracking system, the TeamForge tracker. So if we cross certain thresholds, we would put a defect in the backlog. The build could continue to an appropriate stage, but then ultimately release itself would be gated on the fact that there was an open defect in the backlog that could be treated as a blocker. So that's one way that you can raise it without stopping everything, without necessarily stopping the line prematurely. Okay.
So I'm going to ask Curtis to tee up the next answer to the next question. But I'll certainly say from our experience at Sonatype, in terms of breaking builds, I know that we talk to a lot of clients that we say we can break a build if you have undesirable components, outdated components, open source binaries or libraries within a particular build, or known security vulnerabilities within those. But a lot of what we tell them to do when they're getting started is to use the tools our Nexus Lifecycle tools to monitor kind of what's happening within their builds, and perhaps do that for a month or two before they start to implement or any kind of governance or restrictions, restrictive behaviors on those builds. Because if you say, we're going to block all the level 10 security vulnerabilities that come through on open source components with known vulnerabilities, you don't yet know at the beginning, is that going to break 99% of your builds or 1%? And what is the effective outcome that you're going to generate by implementing those kind of policies? So the use of metrics in that regard to drive the behavior is certainly important, an important consideration, and therefore something that we certainly suggest you don't lead with day one. But if you have the metrics to back up, what that would mean and what impact it would have to your organization, we think that that's the certainly the better approach.
Okay. So you want me to tee up the next question, right? All right, I'm gonna go for the very first one because I think it's sort of at the heart of the original talk and maybe part of a big draw for watching this follow-up, which is, can we please recap the types of tools mentioned that are essential, in quotes, to the CICD DevOps tool chain, for example, SCM CI server, etc. I think we all can. We probably all have some favorite pet tools to name in here, but I started out by saying, when I think about the main part of the factory floor, I think we can all agree there's source code control, there's build orchestration, binary repository, and then deployment orchestration. So to me, that just represents the main heart of the floor, but it glosses over a lot of the tools underneath because we've just mentioned 2 orchestration tools, and they're orchestrating lots of other things. So when we dig into that a little bit, and then I do mention, like, I always, and I say this, Olivier, I say this in almost every customer I'm in, SonicQube is a big part of that because it's the only tool I see in more shops than Jenkins or Nexus. Like, you guys are everywhere. But I will say, then after that it gets into testing tools. What are you doing for testing? Are you doing BDD, TDD, and Selenium's a popular tool there for some of the UI interactions or even the functional testing. You're going to have some kind of monitoring solution. Nagios is a great place to start, but there's a lot of other stuff. Everybody needs a ticketing system behind all of this, as much as we sort of hate to admit it's a part of this factory, but it does drive a lot of stuff and help us stay organized. Jira is clearly a very popular tool there, but anything that meets those needs can be in there, and so the point being, there's chefs and puppets, and there's just so many tools, and I think the trick is not to think that there's a tool or even within a category a specific tool that is the silver bullet of its domain. I think it's important to be open to making sure you're using the right tool for the right job, even if it appears to be some overlap with another tool in your stack, and then you've got to find some balance with that against having every tool, right? So there's got to be somewhere in between. But so that was my answer, and then I know Olivier and others have some stuff to chime in on probably as well.
I would like to. I totally agree with Curtis. I would add to what he said that I think it also depends about your level of maturity. What is right for a certain environment will not necessarily be right for another one. You need to add tools one by one, and as you go along, you will find that some stuff has value when it didn't have any value a few months, few years ago. You think about SonarQube, it's certainly not the first thing you want to put in place in a CI process. But quite rapidly, once you have continuous integration in place, you might want to go there. You might want to look at more advanced stuff. So when we talk about CI, to me, obviously I'm not going to be super objective on this answer, but I think SonarQube is totally necessary for CD. I don't think it's totally necessary for CI. If you want to sustain a practice of CD, you are going to need to look at code quality. Otherwise, it's going to go to production smoothly for a while, but after this while, you won't be able to push anymore.
Interestingly enough, I think it's commendable that you recognize, that you note that SonarQube doesn't need to be included first. But interestingly enough, not being part of SonarQube, I disagree. Right? So I oftentimes see people saying that they implement CI, and you ask, well, what do you mean by you implement CI? Well, we have Jenkins and we manually trigger builds, or we have Jenkins and we do nightly builds. And then we ask, well, what kind of sort of quality management or validation do you do? What level? And I often hear, well, none, but we'd like to. So when I go into these organizations that claim they practice CI, but then we look to migrate them to what I think are ideal or preferred CI practices, oftentimes the first tool I talk about bringing in is going to be a tool like SonarQube. Now, the application of SonarQube, sort of your focus on coverage, what sort of scans and metrics you manage in SonarQube, I think will grow as you shift right or move right from CI to CD, and we can call it shift left or shift right. Which then I also think highlights to your point, Olivier, that the tools that you lose, don't be, I like to say, focus on incremental transformation, be pragmatic, not dogmatic. You will figure out what is the best fit tool for your level of maturity. And really what will happen is as you move from CI to CD, naturally the tools that you need to include that are essential to the delivery process change and grow as you extend your pipeline further from CI to CD.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Olivier, I'd ask you to lead up the next question, if you're prepared. One of the questions on the list.
I will not choose one which is about SonicQube. And next, the one I'm going to choose is how is CI different from CD? I think it's a pretty interesting subject. On we are a software vendor, obviously, but as such we are building software, and that's our main job. And this is a question that we have been asking ourselves for a long time. We thought we had it a few years ago, but now we think we didn't have it at the time. And now we don't think we are there yet, but we are building as we go along. So to me, the main difference between CI and CD is not really which tool you are using, or it's more what you are trying to achieve. I think to me, CI is really about trying to get quick feedback about what you have just pushed, the code that you have just pushed, trying to get as quick feedback as possible, as as valuable as possible. So you want to test as many things as possible, but time is a very important factor in CI, which is if you need to wait 3 hours to get your feedback, I think you are already resolving some. Let me rephrase. I think it's going to be a problem, and you will not get all the benefits. When you talk about continuous delivery, this is much more about having an output which is realizable. So it doesn't really matter how long it's going to take. What matters is how comprehensive the tests are going to be, how many things you do, and the confidence you have that you can take the binary or the set of binaries that are out of this process and push them and use them in the real.
So I'm going to jump in here to add a couple of things. So since I have a developer's background, for me, CI or continuous integration is about, or gives me the confidence if the source code that different developers build and check in, that one works, that the different versions work with each other. So the integration of the source code, that the build works, unit tests are still okay. That's the important thing that for me that CI brings to the table. Since Jenkins is quite easy to set up and automate also the deployment process, a lot of people use their CI infrastructure to automatically deploy the build artifact to a test environment and maybe do some UI tests with Selenium. But that, I think, belongs a little bit more to the continuous deployment and continuous delivery and continuous testing domains. So CD, continuous delivery for me is the automated deployment process all along the delivery chain up to production. So you usually see people having like a delivery pipeline set up, so where every single step, like the build, the UI test, integration test, maybe some performance tests, and then deployment to staging and production, that's all for me covered with CD. So that's where I see the difference.
Yeah, and if I may chime in, Marcel, I agree. I also think another way to look at it, though, especially when we talk about sort of facilitating change within an existing organization, is CI is something that can be implemented within the domain of the development team without having to cross those difficult boundaries or silos of legacy teams. An important thing with CD is CD extends from CI actually to the right, but not only the right, to the left, to involve more stakeholders, right? You're now automating, as you noted, you're automating QA, you're automating deployment. You now need to shift left and give consideration to management of work items, facilitating traceability. So I think it's important to highlight that as you embark from CI to CD, while there's some technical considerations that have to be made, you also have to give consideration to the fact that you're crossing cultural and organizational boundaries.
Yeah, totally agree.
So just to beat this up a little bit more, so as someone who, like I said, started my career when it was SCM, there was no real notion of CI at all. I just think of, at a high level, what I was doing back then was I would get in very early every morning. I had scripts, my build already happened. I had to press a couple CDs, and then I made those available to teams. But basically what was happening there was the build only verified that the code compiled. There was very little testing, at that level in those days. And I had a binary that then started the long journey through testing. And I think what we've seen over the last 20 years, though, is a shift to where with CI we can do more testing and verify and validate the state of those binaries before they do the rest of the journey. So to me, it's anything that can happen before I have a version binary that's going to then enter the rest of the system to be, just to be a little academic in the definition of it. And then the version binary is what's going to move through CD. And I think that's consistent with what other people think of. But I think of like Netflix. Netflix has, I've gone in large shops where we've had 8 and 9 environments. Netflix has build, bake, and prod, and that's it. They have a build process. They throw it into a bake environment. That's their only testing environment, and then it goes to prod. And it's because their build process is so comprehensive in the testing that they have a very high level of confidence in that binary. They throw it in the bake to just make sure there's no insanity, and then it moves on. So as we've shifted left, we've just moved what used to be to the right of the binaries to the left, to the pre-making them. But I think there was a lot of good answers in there, and this is a thing that's been I think Olivier touched on it. This has been changing. This is not a black and white answer. Right. It's been increasingly fuzzy, and now if we introduce Docker containers into the CI process, it just blurs it even more, right? So there's so much that can be done there. But yeah, pre and post binary, sort of authentic version is sort of where I'm going to draw the line.
Just kind of looking at the list of questions that came in, one question that I wanted to ask each of you was, in relation to Docker, the whole conversation started with Marcel building this continuous integration toolchain, which included the CloudBees and Nexus and SonarQube, within that, and Selenium and GitLab and others as well. So there was this factor of how can you quickly stand up one of these environments and get it running if you just want to see how a continuous integration toolchain can work. So 2 questions for each of you is, one, do you see customers that are wanting to deploy and run your applications within a Docker container, within their own environments? And then secondly, how do you work with Docker containers, either producing Docker containers as outputs, analyzing what's inside a Docker container, storing a Docker container, or managing versions of it, what have you. I think everyone kind of plays a role of how do we live with inside Docker, and then what do we actually utilize, or how do we interact with Docker, whether we're in a container or not. Perhaps Curtis, I'll have you lead, and then we'll go down the line.
Well, I was going to suggest Marcel, because the thing about that question I was going to say is I think his project is how do you get started. I think that's the project he shared, that you can just grab that and have 5, 8 things running in one big VM and start to play with them. So did I misread your blog, Marcel? Isn't that what you've provided?
Exactly, yes. So that's that was the starting point, to play around with it, to have it up and running with one single command, and to also have an easy way to try out new versions of the different tools and plugins, since it only has to download a new image, and yeah, that's it. So what we are currently doing at a customer, or at several customers and workshops, is we actually use exactly these Docker containers. with a little modification, obviously. So all the configuration files, data that are generated are stored in volumes and mounted with these Docker containers, but they are all immutable. So we build a Jenkins, we have a fixed nexus in a specific version, and we do build them. So it's a kind of like a hand-egg problem. That's how we say it here in Germany. We do build them with Jenkins as well. So Jenkins, we build the Jenkins Docker image with Jenkins. So we had to have one starting image to have a minimal Jenkins up and running. And now we can actually improve on that. So yeah, that really seems to be working out quite nicely for us. So we have these immutable containers that are versioned, and if for some reason we have a configuration problem in a new version of Nexus or Jenkins, we simply start up the old, previous Jenkins version. And one of the questions also that people ask is Docker production ready, since it's just like 2.5 years old? And I would say definitely yes to that. I think there were 2-3 questions like that. Because the technologies Docker uses, namespacing, C groups, they are not 2 years old, they're like 8-9 years old, I think. They are baked into the Linux kernel. Huge, big companies like, yeah, the typical ones, Google, Amazon, Netflix, they all use Docker in production. I'm not so much sure about the other tools like Kubernetes, Docker Swarm, and the tooling there, but we use plain Docker, and we provision the servers with Ansible in some projects. So that turns out really nicely, and so yeah, a yes to that question, and I hope more and more people start using Docker and yeah, maybe use that project to get up and running.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Derek.
I was just going to ask, how many forks do you have on your GitHub project now? I know I saw over. I know I saw over 60 yesterday. Man.
Yeah, it's 66 right now.
Yeah, so clearly of interest. Who wants to go next on that question? Anyone?
Well, you know, I'd like to, I think, look back and cite some polls from yesterday, as well as some surveys that CloudBees performed. In our yesterday's poll, our afternoon session, we asked, how are you using Docker? For CI/CD infrastructure, for development, for test, or in production. And the close to the majority, sort of second place answer was CI/CD infrastructure. First place at 36%, first place was 37%. Another metric to look at is we at CloudBees issued a survey, and we asked how many of our respondents are using Docker containers for running Jenkins build agents and servers, i.e. the CI/CD infrastructure. 83% of them were using Docker to manage their infrastructure, whereas 68% of them intended to eventually use Docker in both test and production. And I think this shows a couple of things relative to Marcel's project. One is that one of the easiest and safest places to get value from use of Docker and containers is to manage sort of service virtualization or manage infrastructure. And I think we're finding that a lot of people aren't sure about this new technology. They keep hearing about it, and the first sort of courting date one is I'm going to download it and I'm going to use it to stand up technology. And I can use it for internally facing non-customer critical applications, such as virtualizing my services. And then from there, as you gain comfort and build expertise around it, it kind of begins to migrate its way through more through the use to being used to manage applications and application infrastructure. So I think that's a common question and theme that we saw coming out of yesterday, especially around Jenkins. Do I use Docker to manage slaves? Do I use Docker to deliver applications? And the answer is yes. But most of the people we see are starting with managing infrastructure or build tools and then moving to applications.
Yeah, perhaps Olivier, how do you see your customers interacting with Docker?
We have demand for a Docker container for SonicQube, and actually there is one which is pretty simple, but it's there. But it's not huge demand that we have. So so that's to answer your first question. On the second question, internally we have done a few proof of concept with Docker, but at the moment we haven't really moved that way to do automatic provisioning or other things like this. So it's more like something we are looking at, but we are not using it at Sonatype.
Okay. And Curtis, what about Sonatype and your experience talking to clients?
Well, one thing I did want to share, I mean, we do have some training videos on setting up Nexus as a private Docker registry and getting that talking to, maybe just a local Docker environment. So I'll share that link. But one of the things that strikes me, and what I do, and what I am starting to see, not just in clients, but I have the good fortune to attend lots of DevOps days and DevOps meetups and stuff like that. So I am out in the field talking to a lot of folks, and I think one of the reasons this webinar was such a huge draw is I've heard it said on either DevOps Cafe or the Arrested DevOps podcast that using Docker for your Jenkins slaves is one of the killer use cases right now of Docker, of using it in your CICD. I've been in one or two customers that are talking about almost all of their internal tooling they're starting to roll out as Docker images, so their internal supporting infrastructure. And if we think about this, it makes a lot of sense, because if you're going to go learn how to do this, you're starting on these things where it's relatively safe to go cut your teeth, get really comfortable with the technology before you start putting the company's crown jewels in a Docker container out in prod. You'd like to think you had some experience. So I think this infrastructure application is a really big trend because it feels safe. It's a great way to learn. And then I think, in the not too distant future, as people become more comfortable with it, much like the cloud and other things, we'll see the adoption, just move up from there. But right now, I think everyone's cutting their teeth on infrastructure because it just feels safe to them, and it's actually proving quite effective and cost-effective and efficient.
Yeah, I agree.
Good. Brian, you wanted to lead off into...
Yeah, I figured I'd get my opportunity to lead off. I found an interesting question to be, what are some of the ways you have seen companies establish the business case for CI/CD and DevOps projects? What kind of metrics or value are executives seeking? And, I'd say before I answer, there's a couple of ways to look at that, i.e., what are some of the drivers that people use to justify implementation of these practices? I think another way you could present this question, which is a longer answer, is how do people proceed initiating implementation of these practices, proceed with initiation of implementing them. Really, I think there's sort of three value points we hear very frequently, which are often used to identify the value of continuous delivery in DevOps. One would be faster time to market, enabling you to be more competitive and respond to competitive threats, as well as gain and maintain customers. Higher quality software and services, which will allow you to provide a better customer experience and achieve customer satisfaction. And then lastly is increased productivity. So you can recognize increased efficiency and output or throughput, depending on what you want to measure, from your team on that third bullet point. Then there's other ones that I would come across with customers. Actually, another one that I think is important to highlight that I don't think is talked about enough, and that's improving team member satisfaction. Right? So oftentimes an artifact of the old way of doing things is that everybody fights fires, you rely on heroes, you rely on manual one-off processes. As you begin to adopt CI, CD, and DevOps, you are automating things. You're moving away from one-off processes and heroes. And just jumping a couple of steps, ultimately what's ended up happening is people are working less overtime, people are able to innovate more, and you have more satisfied employees. So I've seen some forward-thinking organizations focus on that point, saying we can retain key team members, and our adoption of modern practices and higher quality of life also allows us to attract better talent, which then builds up to things like we have increased productivity, we have higher quality code, we have faster time to market. And then the other part of the question is about metrics before I hand off. I think what you measure in implementing these things, getting above sort of the technical layer of CI into CD and DevOps, is really needs to be what's best fit for your organization, and it needs to be driven by what your objectives are. For instance, if it's quality of life, one thing I've seen measured is sort of workload and overtime, right? One of the things we would like to see is team members are working less overtime, and meanwhile we're seeing fewer Sev1 defects as we deploy. So with that, I'll hand it off to Curtis, because I'm particularly interested in your thought here because it aligns with your experience.
Yeah, and this is one of these things like, I mean, at the end of the day, most companies are still rooted in ROI, right? Return on investment. If I put money in, how much money am I going to get back out? Which is fine. So it's sort of hard to go in and sell those cultural attributes, those soft benefits. Having said that, if your organization, I mean, the key here is always to understand, the climate that you're in, and sort of make sure you're selling them something that's consistent with their own strategy and where they're at. But in my own case, one of the things that was really important was this: you could set up a CI/CD tool chain on a $0 budget. Right? You can get a free tool through all of this. You can upgrade later. So your cost of investment is down. That gave me the freedom to just roll this stuff out. I didn't need a whole lot of permission to do it because everything was free. But then as we captured the metrics and we targeted the metrics that the State of the DevOps 2014 report, not the newest one, we started measuring things like MTTD. What was our defect leaks before, and could we shift those left? Could we find those defects earlier? And then with MTTD came, and then how long did it take us to remediate those? What were those kind of efforts like? And we just started measuring just simple time elements, because time is money in a business. You can always just do a multiplication across your burden labor rate, and engineers are expensive and QA guys, and you can get to some pretty big numbers fast. So for me, if you're just purely in a pragmatic business that's looking for ROIs and dollars and cents, you start measuring time, and as measured by MTDD, MTTR, first failure rates, time to remediate, and in the talk I gave at the Jenkins, last year, we talked about, there was really some significant gains when you go from a manual process to something like this. It is an easy win on those metrics early on. Now, if you're already relatively mature, now you're talking about much smaller, more incremental wins. But to get out of the starting gate, you can pretty much bet your career that you can save a bunch of money by implementing these processes on a shoestring budget, and then just capture the the status quo and the after, and then start to make your case, time is money kind of case, and it's not that hard to do at all.
Well put.
Yeah, Olivier or Marcel, do you want to chime in there, or lead with? You could lead with another question if you want.
I can pick one. I have one that came up also a couple of times yesterday, so I'm just going to read it out. So large enterprises have invested millions, billions into virtualization infrastructure. Do you see deploying Docker containers into VMs becoming a widespread practice as a transitional state, while containers, toolsets mature and companies become more comfortable in the container world? So I think in the slides yesterday we had this image here. I'm just going to post it in the chat. And I think that might have been a little misleading, so that some people might think that Docker replaces VM software, and that is definitely not the case. So all the money, the millions and billions you've spent into virtualization infrastructure and software, that money is well spent. So VMware, for example, allows you to move virtual machines from one data center to another. That is something Docker will hopefully never. That's not the main feature of Docker. So what I see in the companies that I'm at right now, they always, the infrastructure team gives us a bunch of virtual machines where we install Docker, and then in those virtual machines we run 5, 10, or even more Docker containers. So Docker is running not on bare metal, but actually in virtual machines. And so I hope that clarifies that question. And I don't think that running Docker on a bare metal machine will ever be a good idea. Like, yeah. So, anybody wants to comment on that?
I thought Brian had something you wanted to know.
No, what I will do is let people know that I'll drop them a reference on a real-world implementation of Docker on bare metal. So look for a link that is a talk where my colleague R. Tyler Croy walks through the process of managing the Jenkins community infrastructure on bare metal, orchestrating it using the configuration management solution Puppet. So I'll share that case. I think there are cases of Docker on bare metal, though generally, Marcel, what I'm seeing out there and in the current sort of state of Docker, I agree that the predominant case is and will for a while continue to be running Docker on top of a VM.
Kind of shifting gears a little, I wanted to go over to Olivier, and you other guys may have comments on this too, but one of the questions that came in was about, can SonicQube automatically analyze our source code at any specific time, or do we always have to manually analyze the code? And part of that, as part of this discussion, I thought, well, if you're doing it manually, you're not continuous, right? So that's the first part, right? And if you're going to do continuous integration or continuous delivery, continuous testing and analysis has to be part of that. So what kind of practices are you seeing, or are you talking to your clients about how to do that and when? I think you covered this a little earlier, but I thought I should come back to it as a relevant topic on that, continuous testing or continuous quality monitoring of the code that's moving through.
Yeah. Actually, the recommendation on I think it's we heard that already is really to couple SonicQube with a CI engine, whether it's Jenkins, Bamboo, whatever other product. It makes a lot of sense for, I would say, for two main reasons. One is SonicQube cannot go to SCMs, so it has to rely on something which is going to extract the source code, put it on the file system, and then SonicQube can analyze it. And the second aspect is you will want to tie analysis to some events, and tools like Jenkins, for example, they already know how to trigger an action based on those events. Whether it's a commit, whether it's on a regular schedule, whether it's on a push or whatever. You can already use Jenkins features to do that. So basically, basic practice, really best practice, is to couple SonicQube with a CI engine, so that basically it will run whenever you want. You can also run it manually with Jenkins. You can press the little run button.
Yeah, I think one of the important things you brought up earlier too was that even though you can integrate with Jenkins, you were talking about the integration with the IDE. So when you're in the design stage earlier and you think about the concept of shifting left, right? If there's an opportunity to shift left even ahead of the build, then people should take the opportunity to do that. If culturally it has to work with their environments in order to do that and have that acceptable, and it certainly has to scale. No one wants their process to run any slower because of that. And some people that are doing continuous integration or continuous builds, have their time parameters are perhaps a little longer in terms of what can happen then. If you're only running builds every 4 hours or 8 hours or something like that, there's flexibility in terms of what's the response time of the information coming back versus the IDE. If it's not real time, then it has to, it's going to be very challenging to say, hey, just wait an hour in your IDE for some kind of response or indication of quality. That's, certainly not going to be acceptable, I think, to most developers. But maybe some of the other guys have perspective on this as well, regarding continuous testing or continuous analysis at any point.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some level this is a question that it sort of falls into. There's a broader topic as you're setting up your CI pipeline. The first thing you do in that is going to be something that can fail very fast. And then you have to incrementally sort of build, and you've got to pick, like really long-running tasks, you might want to start to move to the right of that process, and really quick tasks, you can move to the left, or you start to think about what can go in parallel. There's a generic question here that I think is going to start to inform your CI pipeline as you optimize it to do the things that are going to give you feedback early, and then continue to verify and validate with longer and longer running kinds of things, and ideally, hopefully not too long. But it's a tension that you're going to see in there, and this is just one of them. So I think the question is, where do I put it in my process, given its length or whatever? I think that it's a problem that you're going to face in a couple other domains as well. If you have really long-running tests or any other things, you're going to have to find ways to segment them and balance them and get that pipeline to be reasonable. And what's automatic and what's manual and what happens all the time and stuff like that. So, and there's a lot of flexibility in that pipeline too. So there's just so much room to craft it the way you want. And I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all solution there, but I think the basic notion of short versus long things are going to really influence where and how you structure that pipeline.
I would add to that, Curtis, that I think you implied it. It's a continuous process. You're really not going to allot, say, a given test or a given validation to a portion of the pipeline permanently, right? As your test coverage goes in a certain area, you move that out. You may find that as far as the fast CI loop goes, certain tests or certain types of validation become less relevant as the application matures, right? You'll shift it out. And I think that underlies an important theme that a lot of people are saying, or thought leaders are saying, is continuous delivery and really continuous integration in comparison with it is a continuous process, right? It is something that you will continuously improve. If you are doing it right, you will never reach a steady state of the pipeline. You will always manage, maintain, and improve it. Another thing that I'd like to add is the Jenkins community has realized that as Jenkins is being applied further right, or as you say, Curtis, we're shifting more left, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made about orchestration of more in-depth, long-running tests in the pipeline. And that used to be really difficult with Jenkins 1 and the manual UI-based job configurations. So to help better support that, what the community has put out, in particular, it goes official with Jenkins 2.0 release in a week or two here, is pipeline as code. So the ability to apply a full Turing complete language with branching, looping, and try-catch to allow you to facilitate a pipeline with stages and parallel testing with manual gates and checkpoints, which is really then giving you a powerful code-based tool set to allow you to not only initially lay out your pipeline to make these decisions, but then manage the improvement and changes on the construct or construction of your pipeline across the life cycle of your CD pipeline, as you would application code. So,
yeah, I would agree.
Thanks.
But it's the thing, like that's what sprint reviews are for, though. I mean, your point at the continuous improvement part. In your sprint review, you got to find out what part of this is working for you and what part isn't working, and continue to iterate on it. It's no different, and it's no different than anything else.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, we're just about to wrap up, but I think Marcel had he just pinged me. There's another question he wanted to cover, so we'll have this be our last question coming up, and anyone can chime in, and then we'll wrap up the broadcast.
Okay, so I just read out the question really quick. So yesterday, Marcel mentioned that development teams usually outnumber DevOps teams member. What is the ideal ratio between dev and ops team members? For example, we have 5 development teams, 30 people. How many team members ideally DevOps should have? So yeah, that was an interesting question. We talked about that before this Hangout started. So there's definitely no easy answer to that, because picking up a ratio without knowing the company and the tools they build and how they're set up, yeah. So our answer would be 42, I guess, without knowing anything. But I think now what I kind of see right now in most companies is that there are a lot of developers hanging around there, like 50, 100, or maybe 200 developers in big enterprise companies, and then you have like 10, 15, 20 ops people that have to deal with at least 10 or 20 times as many developers. And as there are more and more tools coming into the enterprise world, so they're not just like a WebSphere and a DB2 database, but now there's also graph databases, document databases, different programming languages, and they all need to be supported in prod. And here I see Docker being a really, really big game changer. So the development teams now can actually provide these Docker files, Docker images, and ops team only needs to spin them up and mount a couple of volumes, mount a couple of configuration files, and provide some environment variables, and then these applications are up and running in no time. And so you have this immutable infrastructure with Docker where you have these containers, run them on your local machine, put them on test, move them to production, and nobody needs to write a deployment manual for the operations guy who has to deploy 10 or 20 different applications late at night and do firefighting and all the other things he needs to do on this side. So my answer to that question, what's a good ratio, is use Docker, see if Docker can help you, and let your developers provide these Docker containers for your ops team, and then your ops team might end up having more time for the real things they actually need to worry about. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, my thing was, you're right. I think this was an interesting question, because I don't think there is a right answer, but I do think, your ratio is whatever it is today, and I do think as you mature, that ratio will become better, right? You'll need less people to support more people, or less people can support more people. And so I do think it's indicative of your maturity. And then I think the goal is to not have that ratio at all, but to have a cross-functional team that can do what it needs to do. And the idea of having a separate team support them is sort of orthogonal to I think the goal of all of this in DevOps. So your ratio is what it is. Use it as a benchmark. Use it to measure as another indicator, if you will, of your maturity. And the goal is to put that team out of business, right? I think that's how you look at it.
And +1 on that goal, Curtis.
Yeah.
Okay, well, hey gentlemen, I really appreciate the time. One, that you contributed, Brian, Curtis, Marcel, Olivier. I think it was a great conversation, and I know that everyone that attended yesterday's webinar that wants to look at the Q&A session, has now access to this video if they weren't able to attend the broadcast live. So I really appreciate you guys contributing your time, as well as all the contributions you're making out in the community, certainly with your products, and then your time in front of clients and helping them engage and learn from these experiences. So thank you very much. Really appreciate having you guys on.
Awesome.
Thanks for organizing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Okay. Cheers. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.